Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Tom Concolino, and I'm here with our presenters, Angela Criswell and Aya Takaze.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you all for attending Rigaku's workshop series on X-ray computed tomography for materials and life science. Now, this workshop will be the second in our deep dive series covering filtration analysis, and will focus on segmentation and properties. So this session will be taking place in the lab, with Angela and I reviewing in real time how to deal with the unique challenges of performing CT experiments on filter media samples. Now, please note, if you missed any of the previous webinars, you can view them on the Rigaku website. We also want to welcome back Dr. Philip Eichner as a guest panelist. He'll be able to add additional thoughts and answer questions throughout the session. But before we start, a few housekeeping items. Now, as we've been doing with all of our workshops, this is going to be an interactive session. So we'll be taking your questions live during the workshop, and we'll be answering them during the session. So please don't wait until the end to ask. And as usual, please submit those questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And as per usual, I won't be monitoring the raised hand function, and I'll be posting relevant links in the chat window. Now, we'll be trying to answer as many questions as we can during the workshop, and we'll respond to any unanswered questions directly after the session is complete. If for whatever reason you have difficulty viewing the webinar live, please note that it is being recorded and you'll be able to view the recording beginning tomorrow. Now, with that said, I'll turn it over to Angela and Aya.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Aya. And thank you to everyone for joining us for the workshop. And I especially want to thank you, Philip Eichheimer, for joining us again. Philip's from Math to Market, and he's going to provide his expertise today. So as usual, we're live from our office in the Woodlands, and we are in the second part of our deep dive workshop series. So in the three segments that started last month we covered data collection. Here we're going to cover segmentation and property analysis, and then we'll wrap up in December where we'll cover filtration simulations. And specifically for today, the things we're going to cover are how to identify and segment fibers, how to analyze the fiber media properties after you've done your segmentation, and then finally, we're going to look at how to model fiber media. And of course, just like in previous workshops, the data that you see today was collected by either I or myself. In particular, the fiber media were collected on the Nano 3DX. And we chose that because it provides high resolution data and great contrast for soft materials like fiber media. And also we'll be using the GeoDic software package from Math to Market in this workshop, as well as for the rest of the series. And Tom can give you a link to their website. All right, so recall from last month that this is the filter optimization pathway. And in the first session, we covered the CT data collection, and this month we're going to look at fiber media analysis and fiber modeling before we move on. And the first step of this process is that we have to segment our CT data. And specifically during this step, we need to assign every voxel to be either filter media or air. And that's going to lead us to our first poll question for today.
Okay, so let me launch the first question. So the question is, which tools are useful for improving segment results? So you have 4 choices, and you can choose as many as you want. The choices are image filtering, artificial intelligence, O2 binarization, and the morphological operations. Answers are coming in fast. More than half of you made your choices. I'm gonna wait a few more seconds. They're pretty evenly distributed, I think, the votes are.
Yeah, they can do multiple choice, so
Mm-hmm.
you expect lots of votes here.
Okay, so more than 80% of the audience voted. So I'm gonna end the poll and share the results. Image filtering was the most popular, but everything else got their votes too.
Exactly. And we're going to see some of these today. So remember, when you segment, sometimes you can get some errors in assignments. So you could have some error voxels that are incorrectly assigned as fiber, and we need to clean that up. And image filtering in this list, which was the winner, is definitely one way to do that. You can also use artificial intelligence, or you can use morphological operations. And O2 binarization is the first step usually before you go to cleanup. So that's so 3 of them were correct in this case.
I'm gonna stop sharing, and there you go.
All right. So the next slide I borrowed from the Digital Rock series and modified it slightly that I has already presented to you before. And I borrowed it because it has an excellent workflow for what we want to accomplish to segment our filter media. And the easiest thing that we can do is to use thresholding or O2 binarization. And in fact, if that works, we are done. And if not, we can do some things like image filtering. Basically, we want to reduce the noise and then try to run thresholding again. And if that works, of course, we're done. And if it doesn't, then we need to go to some more complex methods to clean things up. And some of the things that you can use are artificial intelligence segmentation, which GeoDict offers, or you can use morphological tools. And if you recall, we did a workshop about morphological tools in particular. And if we had this noisy data set where many error voxels were mislabeled as fiber, and we wanted to clean that up, how would we do that? And that's going to lead to our next poll.
Okay. So this is also related to segmentation. Let me launch it first. Okay. So here's the second question. Which morphological operation would be optimal to improve these segmentation results? And you have 5 choices: kill borders, opening, dilation, watershed transform, and erosion. That's a lot of choices.
It's a lot of choices, but there are so many
This is
different
single
tools
choice,
you can
right?
use. Yes, correct.
There's a one answer.
That's right. And if you don't remember these, go back and watch that session that we did on morphological operations. The thing is that you want to get rid of the noise without modifying your true assignments for sure. That's the trick.
Mm-hmm. And you're working on the segmentation when you use the morphological operations.
Exactly.
Okay, I think most of you voted, and it's very evenly distributed. I'm going to end the poll and show the results. So they're all somewhere around 15-25%, but maybe a watershed transform is the winner.
Well, it's in the lead, but it's not the correct choice. So watershed is something that you might do once you've segmented everything into separate blobs. So maybe you want to separate pores and identify each of them individually. So that's not correct. Kill borders, anything touching the border gets eliminated. That's not correct. Dilation and erosion are either going to add or subtract, but they're going to do it in a global way. So also not correct. But opening combines dilation and erosion. So it's actually the correct answer in this case.
Okay.
All right. So then let's just keep moving on. And here we have a perfectly segmented scan of our fiber media. So this is what we want to end up with once we're complete with that step. And when we take a closer look, what we can see here is that there are some thickened areas in this segmented data. So some of these fibers look pretty thick, and it turns out that this thickened area is called binder. And this binder material is often found in fiber media, and it serves important roles. So why do you think that some manufacturer might choose to add binder to fiber media? And again, back to another poll question.
Okay. I guess you're going to explain it, but we'll ask the audience first. So this one is a true or false question. And the statement goes, binder is added to filter media to improve mechanical strength, to enhance filtration of contaminants, and to reduce flammability. Is that true or false? About half of you voted. I'm going to wait a few more seconds to let you think about it. Okay, I think most of you guys voted, so I'm gonna
Fine.
close
Yeah.
the poll.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that everybody is awake and still listening.
Everybody's participating today. It's great.
I have to ask a lot of questions.
And let me share the results. So this one, overwhelmingly, I think everybody chose, not everybody, but most of you chose true.
And in the case of our filter media, all of these are absolutely true. So it's gonna add mechanical strength. It's actually going to catch some of these particles or contaminants that we want to filter out or catch. And then also we can add some chemicals that might change the chemical properties of the fiber media material. So we might want to add charge to it. We might want to add something that reduces its flammability and so on. So there are a number of different binder materials, and the one that a manufacturer chooses has to fit the type of filtration they need. All right. So on to the next one. So then that kind of leads us into the next step. And we learn that not only do we have to segment everything, we have to identify which is which. And so we have to label binder and fibers separately. But this process is complicated by the fact that the fibers and the binder often have the same gray levels in our CT data. So we can't separate these two phases using simple thresholding. And luckily, GeoDict has some great artificial intelligence tools that help us do exactly that. And it works because the shapes of the binder and the shapes of the fibers are quite distinct, of course. So at the same time, this only works if the ground truth models in GeoDict are closely matching the reality of our CT data. And that means that there are some constraints we need to pay attention to, and I'll go through those as we go through here. So we have this here where the dark gray is our segmented fiber media, and the light gray is the air. And the first step we're going to do is we're going to run a tool called binder find, and it's going to find the binder and label it. And this will result in, now we have two materials, two solid phase materials, one fiber and one binder. And from this step, if we ignore the binder, we can use fiber find to identify each individual fiber, and we end up with this labeled data set where each fiber is individually labeled. And now we can perform some analyses. But before we do all of this, we want to ask, okay, what were those constraints you were talking about? Well, first, there's a constraint on the size of fibers for binder find and fiber bind. They need to be in a specific range, and that's clearly told to you in the software. So somewhere at a minimum of 4, maximum about 14 or a little higher are where you need to be. What if that's not the case? Well, you can resample your data. There are tools to do that in GeoDict, or you may have to go back and collect some more data. I'm going to show you how to resample that in here so you know how to do it. Second constraint is that some networks require the fibers to be oriented mainly in the XY plane so that your filtration experiment goes through the Z plane. That's completely easy to change in GeoDict, and we're going to look at that as well. And the final constraint that I'll mention is that fiber identification in GeoDict 2022 only works for circular fibers. I expect they're working on other ones to go forward. Maybe Philip can mention that. But for now, we're just going to work with some circular fibers. And if you have things like hollow fibers or trilobal fibers, you might need to create your own ground truth to work with those. So with that said, what are the types of analyses that we can do? Well, of course, we'll want to look at porosity and grammage. And as soon as the segmentation is done, we're going to get a value for the porosity and the grammage. So that happens right away. We also want to calculate the fiber lengths. We want to calculate their diameters. We want to look at a distribution of those. We also want to look at fiber curliness, fiber curvature, and of course, fiber orientation is something we might be interested in. So many of these probably really straightforward, make sense, but curliness and curvature may not be so straightforward. So I'm going to show you exactly what each of those are. But before I show you, Aya's got a question.
Okay. So this is the fourth and the last question we're going to ask you. So the question is, what is the difference between fiber curvature and fiber curliness? And you have two choices. Those are a little bit tongue twisters, but the first choice, fiber curliness is a local measure, while fiber curvature is a measure along the entire fiber length. Or fiber curliness is a measure along the entire fiber length, while fiber curvature is a local measure. Did I read this right?
Yeah, I think you did.
Yep.
Okay.
You got to pay
Curliness
attention
and
on that.
curvature.
Which one's local and which one deals with the full length of the
Mhm.
fiber? That's basically what we want to ask. you.
Right. It's kind of half and half. the
This is
votes.
a,
It is.
nobody knows the answer.
Well, I didn't either until I started reading the documentation.
That's
So
right.
if you haven't read it, then you're going to get a
Yeah,
little
you
primer right
wouldn't
now.
know, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I think
Exactly.
most of you voted. Let me close the poll and share the results. Exactly 50-50%.
Nice.
So half of you, you're about to learn something.
Might be more than half, because there might
More
have been
than
some
half,
guesses
maybe,
in
yeah.
that in the 50%
Absolutely.
that got it
So
right.
which one is correct, Angela?
Well, it turns out that curliness is along the entire length and curvature is local. And that doesn't tell you anything. So we're going to dive in and look at exactly how they're
Okay.
done. Okay, so let's make some sense of this. So let's first look at curliness. So if you look in the documentation, this is how curliness is defined. You measure the full length of the fiber and you divide that by the distance between the start and the end of the fiber. So it takes into account the entire length. So what does that look like in some examples? So I just took a piece of string and some ruler and did some back of the envelope calculations for this. And the length of my fiber in this case is 380 millimeters. And I calculate the distance between the start and the end. And that's these values that are shown in red. And then I end up with some curliness value. So what you can see is that the more compact a fiber is, the higher the curliness value. And that goes down as the fiber gets straighter. And in fact, you can imagine a straight fiber has a value of 1 because the distance between start to end is the same as the fiber length in that case. So you get more compact as curliness value increases. So how about curvature? Well, curvature is a local measure. And so basically you draw a circle at each of the curved points, and the radius, the curvature is equal to 1 over the radius of that line. So what about, let's go back to our examples and look at those. So we'll add some circles in, and you would add them at every point you have this curvature. We're going to calculate the diameter and get their radii, and then we end up with a curvature values that we see here. And so what I hope you see here is that for the one on the top where the big circle and the radius is large, then the value of the curvature is small. And an inverse relationship happens with the smaller it is. So the more kinkiness you have in your fibers, then you're going to have a higher curvature in that case because of the virtue of the small radii in those cases. All right, so now that you know what those are, let's go on. So what about orientation? And Geodict uses 2 methods to determine fiber orientations. But before we pick a method, The volume is divided into some blocks like shown here. So we have 4 blocks that are along the z-axis and they span the full XY plane. And for each of these blocks, we can use one of two methods. The star length distribution tool looks at the chord lengths through each voxel in a block to determine the orientation tensor of a fiber, and then it averages it over the entire block. Alternatively, the principal component analysis method divides each block into even smaller windows where fiber fragments are analyzed to find the direction tensor in each window, and then it's averaged across all windows to get a value for the entire block. And we end up with something like this. So we have an orientation per block. And this is the result for the fiber media that's shown on the left. So once we end up with all of these values, then what do we do with all of it? Why are we even doing this in the first place? Well, ultimately, remember, we're going through a pathway where we're trying to optimize our fiber media for the application we want to do. So once we have all of these values, now we can start to calculate some model filter media. And the first step is to prepare a digital twin of our existing one. And to do that, we're going to need those parameters we all just calculated, and then we're going to vary some of them. So we might vary the fiber diameter. We might vary the thickness of the media itself. And it turns out there are a number of different parameters that you can change in GeoDict, and you can create thousands of models for filtration experiments. And eventually what you would do is you'd pick the subset that has the characteristics you want, manufacture them, test them, and hopefully the goal here is to make the process faster and less expensive. So that's why we're doing all of this. All right, so let's get ready for some hands-on with GeoDict. That's why we're here. So any questions while I get things switched over?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, so we did have a couple of questions come in. So while you're doing that, the first question is why, in general, for filtration materials, why is curliness and curvature important? Why do you need to measure them? Is there some reason that these are right? That that you want to measure these, that you need to measure these?
I would imagine it has something to do with density, but that's probably that's a good question for Philip. Why do manufacturers care about these curves in the fiber?
It goes down sometimes to have like what we call a statistical twin. So we extract the information from micro-CT, and then we want to reproduce filter media which has exactly exactly same statistical characterizations. So we of course need also some kind of measure for how fibers are curled or if they are straight, because this of course has an influence on later on physical parameters which you want to calculate in filtration simulations. So this is something, of course, we want to reproduce it. We can create a digital twin using our fiber geo module. We can input all the fiber diameter distributions, the lengths of the fibers, the sizes of the fibers, and then create a so-called statistical digital twin, which has exactly the same statistics as the micro-CT. And then we can start here doing simulations and optimize the filter media, figure out which kind of the parameters has the largest effect on pressure drop, fraction filtration efficiencies, and so on.
Exactly. Yeah, the pressure drop rather, comes up a lot, right? So then it makes sense. If they're all straight fibers in the same direction, they're not going to catch things as well as if they're mixed orientations and such. So that makes complete sense. All right. So hopefully you guys can all see the GeoDict software interface. I'm just moving each of your little cameo pictures over here out of the way. So do you see the GeoDict software?
We do.
Excellent. So then the first step we want to do is to import some data and start working with it. So I've got the GeoDict interface open. I'm going to go to import, select import GeoVol. I'm going to browse for where my data are. And the first time you run GeoDict, it always creates my first GeoDict project. Turns out that's not where our data are. our data are in this directory. So I'm going to select the first one, and it opens a geometry input dialog window. And in this case, we need to absolutely enter in the voxel length. If we want to calculate quantitative values, then we need to make sure we have the right spacing. We could also at this point do some cropping if we want, but I want to show you that interactively. So I'm just going to go straight to the image processing field. And you see here, it tells you approximately how much memory it's going to use, how much is going to be left, how many images it's going to import during this particular process. And at the end of it, we get a new window and we can start having a look. Just a couple more seconds. All right, so here we go. So this is the image processing interface. We can move things around in here. I can make the windows larger, smaller. If I'm on the actual data and I right click, I can zoom in or out. And what happens is immediately as you open it, it tries some rudimentary segmentation, and that red tint you see is the segmentation. So if I basically turn that down, turn the visibility to a lower value, then we can see the data underneath. And immediately I need to do a couple of things. So the first thing is I want to show you how to crop this. And the second thing is, if we look at where is, how are our fibers oriented, we see that they're not oriented correctly because we need the filtration experiment to go through the Z plane. So we should have this plane going along Z. So we're going to switch that too. So crop, we're going to go here first. Just going to grab, I have a hard time picking those little yellow edges. So I just like to give myself some working room. We're going to grab some values here. Maybe a little smaller based on this down here. I don't need to use all of this media, so I'll just use a subset of it. Okay, and once I'm done and I'm happy, I just click apply. And so it's going to crop out all the other stuff and leave just the piece that I was interested in. It's pretty small, so I can zoom in a little bit. And the next thing that we want to do here is we want to permute the axes so that we have the fiber in the XY plane. Okay, so if I go to image alignment, permute, then I can select this one. There are a few tools available to you, and it turns out it's really quick and easy to do. So now my fibers are orthogonal to the Z-axis, and they're aligned in the XY plane that I can see here. And so I can dive through each of these and have a look. One of the other things you'll notice is that it's attempted to do some segmentation. So that's the red labels. It looks not so bad. So let's try to actually do that. So we want to create a segmented data set using Otsu binarization. And there you can use that or some other means in here. We're just going to use the default and create a segmentation and just see how it looks. All right, so after segmentation, we have a porosity value, says it's about 0.936. And we also have the grammage that's reported in the interface here. It's about 83.5. Okay, so let's have a look at these results in 3 dimensions and evaluate how well we did. So I closed the image processing window, and this is the main interface for Geodic that opens. I want to look at this in 3D. And we'll see we have an overlay of our CT data, which is the grayscale image, with our segmented data set. And we can manipulate these to look the way we want them to. So in the volume field, we can filter out some of the intensity values, or we can just straight up turn it off if we want to. And then we're left with the structure field, which is our segmented data. And we can make that smoother and enhance the the visualization of it by going to some of these other tools, some depth darkening, just to make it more visually appealing. So one of the things you should immediately notice here is we've got some noise. And in this case, there are pixel or voxels rather that are in the air that are mislabeled as fiber. And we certainly don't want to use this to calculate quantitative values or to go any further. So what exactly should we do? Well, we need to go back to image processing, and let's start using the image filters that we talked about. So I'm going to right click on the gray value image, open it in image processing again. We're going to go back to image processing, and then what we want to do or go to some image filters. And you see there are quite a number of them that are included with GeoDict. My favorite by far is the non-local means filter, and I like it because it reduces noise, but at the same time it retains the edges of features. And we talked a lot about the non-local means filter in a previous workshop, as well as some of these others. If you're interested, you want to go back and hear more about them. So GeoDict has this great tool in here where you can preview results by varying at least one of these parameters. So if I click preview, I get this window. And at this point, I can say, okay, what parameters do I want to use for the non-local means filter? Let's use the strength, which was the third in the list. And we're going to use a fixed value of 1 for patch radius and 3 for the window radius. And we're going to look at the strength from a value of 0.3 to 0.5. And we want to look at a preview. Sure. All right, so then we end up with these results here. They're small, I can't really see them. So you can select a zoom value from the list here. On the left is our original image, and you can see it looks kind of choppy. With 0.3, we get some smoothing. It looks good, but there's still some bright areas in the background. And here, if we use a value of 0.4, it's even better. And at 0.5, it's better, but the edges are kind of getting a little fuzzy. So let's just choose the value in the middle here. We'll say our filter strength we want to use is 0.4. And of course, you can play around with this yourself to get a feel for these different parameters. So I'm just applying the non-local means filter, and it just takes a couple of seconds. And of course, the next step is going to be, if we use thresholding now, what do our results look like? So that's going to be the next thing that we do. We're going to go to the segmentation tab, and we're going to give this a try again with the default Otsu binarization and create a segmentation. And we don't really care to keep the previous segmentation results, so I'll just overwrite it. So one of the things you'll notice immediately is that the grammage has changed. Now it's 55, so much lower. And our porosity is now closer to 0.939. Our solid volume fraction in this case is 6%, and which is a little smaller than the previous value. So we'll close this. Let's close this dialog and have a quick evaluation of what it looks like. So we'll just filter some of this out. You just turn it off, frankly. And this is much cleaner. So this is what we're going to use to do our analysis going forward. If you don't care for the color, you can change it. I tend to like to change that. So over here on the right side, you see some tools that will change how this looks and where things live. I'm going to change our solid volume fraction from red to white, and it looks more like a grayscale image now. Okay, so that's basically our finished segmented data set. And we do see these thickened areas between fibers, and that's our binder that we're going to have to separate. But remember, we have constraints here. So we need to ask a question, is our data ready for finding binder in fibers? So we can quickly do that. In Fiber Find, you have a list of options, and we can ask to estimate what those fiber diameters are. And we go to edit. We basically only have one material at this point labeled. So we're going to use that, and we're going to use all of the defaults, and we're going to run. And this doesn't take very long, so we can do this live with you. So it turns out some of these operations can take quite a while, as you might imagine. The filtration can take a while. We'll talk about that as we go along through the workshops. All right, so now what we see is the results from this run. And we have an average diameter of 21.9 with a standard deviation of 5.9. That's huge. It's quite big. If we look at a plot of this, these are all the diameters. If we prefer to look at it in micrometers, we can do that. But the important question, remember, is it the appropriate size? And remember, our voxel size was 2.6. So 21 divided by 2.6, it's around 8. So we're right in this sweet spot for our fiber diameter size in this case. So we're going to use this data set going forward. However, you might ask, what do I do if it doesn't match? Well, that takes us back to our gray value image again, and we right click and we open an image processing. And if our fibers are the diameter needs to be changed, then we can go to the image size and we can downsample. If you need to upsample, you're going to have to go back and collect some more CT data. But downsampling is quite easy to do. And more often than not, I found that my data sets are high resolution enough that downsampling is all I need. So you simply pick a factor. In this case, it's going to bend 2 by 2 and apply. Just takes a couple of seconds to do, and away you go. I'm going to close this because our data set is just fine in this case. So what now? So first thing we want to do is we want to identify the fiber and the binder, because we don't want to use the binder in our fiber analysis tool. So to do that, we go to identify binder. We can open the dialog to edit this, and it takes a couple of seconds. This is where we played Jeopardy music, I guess.
Looked like it popped up. Did it come up behind the window?
Nope, it's not.
No.
It's
There.
it's thinking.
Yeah.
That should be on our list to learn to sing it.
Yes, it should be. Yeah. Or we've budgeted for a new computer with a faster GPU. So that's
There
gonna
you go.
help too. Exactly. But we use our computers for a few years. So this one has a slower processor and GPU. Okay. So this is the binder identification dialog. And in the identification mode, it asks you exactly what do you want to analyze. I could have lots of materials loaded here. I want to use the current structure. If I had created my own ground truth model, then I can load a neural network output that I've done previously. We're using all the solid materials, and it gives you an idea of what your limitations are. We're not going to change anything in this dialog. We're just going to say, okay, and we're going to run. However, this does take a little while to run. So I have run this previously, and I'm going to load the results, and it'll give us an idea of exactly how long it took to run. So identify binder in this case, and it opens the dialog with the results. So when I ran this previously, it found there was less than 1%, or specifically 0.897% of that labeled structure is actual binder. And that job took just over 32 minutes to finish, and used about 6 gigabytes of memory. And we get an idea of the distribution of the binder throughout the Z layer So here is the Z layer, and this is the percentage of that total structure where it appears. So we see in 1/2 of the filter, there's less binder than there is over here. So maybe we could see that, for example, it doesn't look that subtle. So we could ask, let's have a look at what it looks like. And we can load the structure again with the binder labeled in a different color. And we'll do just that. So then it's back here. So we'll say close. So again, our fibers are still labeled with the white color, but now the binder material is labeled green. And so what we notice here is that there's quite a bit of it, even though it doesn't make up much. And for sure, the top half, as the Z value increases, the binder amount also increases in this case. So it makes sense in this case. So then our next step is, let's ignore the binder and analyze the fibers alone. So that step is also in the FiberFind dialog. It's under Identify Fibers. And again, we can select some options in this case. And the method we want to use is the machine learning, the inherent artificial intelligence tool that comes with the GeoDict tool. And we're going to basically tell it that we don't want to analyze all the materials. We specifically only want to look at the white fibers in this case. And leave it as that. And then we click run. So again, that takes a little while. So we're going to open up a results file that's shown here, Identify Fibers. And this opens the results, and it's chock full of all sorts of interesting information. So first we end up with a report. So it says it found a class of fibers, and in this class there are 597 fibers, and their average diameter is 16.4. That's much less than the 21 that we got when we had all of the segmented data. And that's because it included binder material. So that makes complete sense. And on average, the length is about 542 microns, and it has some curvature and curliness value associated with it. We also get the orientation evaluated and a number of different tables that you can look at. It's usually more interesting, and you can extract something visually by looking at a plot. So we're going to do that. We're going to do that. So we have the fiber length versus the probability. We also have the fiber diameter distribution. It's expressed in meters. So everything by default in GeoDict is expressed in meters. So they have a lot of physicists there. So physicists like meters. If we prefer, like if you're like me and you prefer to look at microns, you can certainly do that and say apply. The first thing I really noticed in looking at this plot was that it looks like there are two different classes of fibers with two different average diameters. So if you wanted to dive into that, you certainly could. You can just change the number of fiber types to 2 and click apply. And now you have two classes of fibers. So now you have this class, and your report is updated, and it says, okay, 371 of those 597 fibers are in class 1 with an average diameter of 14.6, and 226 have an average diameter of 19. So it's about a 60-40 split in this case. We can look at some more plots. So of course, we have the output of the fiber orientations in the XY plane. And these are less interesting than that because we're interested in the XY plane. We can look at the curvature distribution throughout. It's a single, the curliness distribution. And one of the other things I think is kind of interesting to look at, if we look at the fiber angle to X distribution, this is the orientation as you pass through the Z axis through the fiber. We see it starts off at right above 60. It drops, it increases to just over 50, drops to around just over 35 and hovers there, through about half of the thickness of the fiber media, and then drops down again and increases until it gets to the other side. So you can look at how exactly are all of these, how is the orientation distributed? And perhaps what you might see is you might have different layers that are distributed at different angles. All right, so we might also want to look at this result. So identified fibers is going to load each of the fibers, or perhaps we might want them, they're segmented fibers by their properties. And the property we chose to separate fibers, remember, was diameter. So I want to look at, for example, are the thick fibers and the thin fibers distributed evenly throughout? And we can certainly do that. So the small fibers, class 1, are the white ones. And now the green labels are the class 2 thicker fibers. And just by looking at it visually, we see that they're pretty much distributed throughout. So they're pretty much everywhere. It's not one distinct layer of these guys. All right, and for this run, for the fiber find, it took about 10 minutes in that case. All right, so now if we go back to the report, let me just open that back again and identify fibers. So we have all of the parameters that we've calculated. And now what we want to do is to try to create this digital statistical twin, right? So that goes to our next step. And I found it really helpful that Geodict has this export tool that you can save it as an HTML, and then I can print it out so that I can cheat to create my models. So we want to create our twin. We're going to go to Model, Fiber Geo, and go to Create, and we're ready to create fiber media. And so right now, there's no way to just directly import that and say, create my twin. It's quite complicated, but I hear that they're working on it. So let's just create fiber media quickly. This will also give you the opportunity to learn how to enter all of these parameters if you need to, and what their effects are. So let's say 600 by 600 by 400 thick. Our voxel length, we'll just keep it consistent as with before. We're going to allow fiber overlap, and we want to target a 6.1% solid volume fraction. We can look at our individual fiber options. So in our case, they were not short, they were not infinite circular. They actually had some curvature. So we're going to say curves. Circular is what we need to add. We'll remove these and add. We had 2 classes, so let's just go ahead and enter 2 classes. Class 1 was around 60. Class 2 was around 40. And the fiber diameters, recall, were about 14.6, and they were 19-ish. And the length of these, or let's look at the orientation. We had that anisotropic orientation that we were given with our output, and we can say, okay, let's just enter those values itself. So I have these right in front of me, 7.2, 0.55, 17.7, 5.78, and minus 25.5, and say okay. And I can do the same thing here, that they have anisotropic orientations, and use the output from our run. Okay, so I've just input some diameters, and I've input their orientation. We could just ask the question, if I just use the default curliness option, what do they look like? Are we even in the general category of likeness? So we can quickly look at that, and it turns out it's really quick to run. So we can do that live with you.
So close.
So close. All right. So it gives you some output and it says, how close did I actually match what you wanted me to do? So it says, well, I wanted a target solid volume fraction of 6.1. I wanted a 60-40 mix, and it says, okay, this is what it realized, and gives you some error in that case. Let's have a look at it. Oh my gosh, this looks like ramen noodles. It's not ramen,
It
but
does.
it's not correct, right? So then what would I do in this case to change this? And that's where these curl values, by selecting that specific fiber type, I can mess around with them a little bit. So let's look at the curl for each of these. And here's where it gets a little subjective. So you have random, you can say there's spirals or there's sine, but we're just going to say, hey, let's leave it at random. And let's look at what options we have. So we have a segment length, and it's now currently set at 10. So segment length is the straight distance between each curl. So the ramen noodles have very short segments between each of the curls. That's not correct. So we want to increase that. So let's just say 50. We know all of our fibers for each class look the same, so we're going to use the same values. And then you have a local straightness and a global straightness. So the local straightness is basically saying, how much curl do you want? And it has a value from 0 to 1. And if you have a value of 0, they're straight. And if you have a value that's, if you have a value that's higher, then you're implementing some curvature. And we're just going to split it down the middle to start with. And the global straightness, if you hover, you see it gives you some tooltips there. It says, okay, how much do you want your fibers to tend to your prescribed orientation for the length of your fiber media? Well, we'll just, again, split this in the middle, and then you have to add some randomness value. We could pick a default, but let's crank it up a bit to 0.2 and say, okay, now what does it look like and how much is this going to change? So we'll click generate. I don't need to keep the ramen, so I'll just overwrite that structure. Just takes a couple of seconds to run. And again, it gives us some measure of how well it matched the target results that you wanted. But really, we want to visually see what it looks like. Now we're getting somewhere. So you can see that some minor tweaks could get you in the general direction that you want to go. Then you want to run the filtration and see if you have the pressure drop that you expect and the other characteristics, and then create all of your digital twins to do your stepwise analysis of the models. Before you do that, you might also want to add binder. Our particular fiber did have binders, so there's an option to do that. And in this, you'll see that you can set a solid volume fraction. You can select the contact angle for how your binder intersects with your fiber, whether or not it's anisotropic, and you can look at how it's distributed throughout and click OK and run. And this takes a little while to run as well. I did not run that for you today. We don't really have time to do that, but certainly I would encourage you to play with that. But basically, you saw the process of how we segment, how we analyze, and now how do we start to create models. And what I want to do is to go back, and we're going to wrap up for the day. Go here and share. So you should see the PowerPoint slide again. Do you see that now?
Yes.
We do.
Okay, so just to wrap up the things we covered today is we looked at how to identify and segment fibers and binder. And then we analyze those fibers for various properties, including their diameter, their orientation, their curliness, their curvature, and so on. And then finally, we briefly looked at how do you start to model that fiber media. And with that, we'll end for today and maybe have time for some questions.
All right, so we do have time for a short Q&A. We've had one more question come in, and I actually have a question myself. So the first question, this goes back to slide 20. Angela, I had to go back and find it. Is how do you calculate these orientation tensors? Is that something you know, or do we need to put Philip on the spot here?
Yeah, I described it briefly, but let's let Philip address this question.
Yeah, I think the question goes for the orientation tensor for each block.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So this is like the second. We don't go per each voxel, we go per blocks. And in this we go for each block, and I think currently we go for 32 voxels in each direction. And then we per block we make a connected components graph to get all the kind of different fibers in these kind of blocks. And then we assume these kind of components to be a point cloud, and then we fit here an ellipsoid. And this gives us the orientation for this kind of block. And this we go then from the smaller scale, we average them up to the larger scale. So each blocks are then have the orientation, and then we average these for all the other blocks, and then for the entire domain. So this is like from a small scale, we then go back to the larger scale again. And then the first one is like it goes per voxel and goes through each sample and has this kind of orientation methods.
Excellent.
One of the things I'll just mention about that, by default, GeoDict will try to determine what your block size should be. But I noticed you can modify that and customize it if you want to. I just let it use the defaults in my case.
Okay, and then the question that I had, and this is again for probably both of you. So when you did your first fiber find, obviously this was before we did anything with the removing the binder and splitting them into the two segments, right? Came up with a 21 micron average and standard deviation of 5. Is that a data quality issue, or is that a simply binder is just making this massive contribution to this error essentially, right?
Yeah, I think that's in our case. Philip, how much do you find the variation between if you calculate it with binder versus not?
Yeah, it depends mostly where the binder is distributed or how is it distributed. So of course, when you do like the quick fiber estimate or the AI, it always tries to find the center lines of each fiber. So this can be, sure, they can distinguish between two fibers, but the very quick fiber diameter orientation just uses the slices. And then of course, if you have two fibers in between your binder, it takes it as one fiber, which is of course wrong in this kind of sense. But, so this is always necessary to remove first the binder, and then to get a more clear data. And this is the good stuff with GeoDict. You get like direct visual feedback. So nothing is more precise than the eye in our case. You always see what's happening, and this is like the great benefit you can use in GeoDict. You always see what the parameters do, and you can check the segmentation, and then you can directly see the grayscale image, and you see the segmented image, and you can say, okay, this is what I would expect, or this is not what I see, and then you can modify the input again, and the segmentation process can be optimized.
Yeah, and even though it took either 10 minutes or 30 minutes to do a run, in the grand scheme of things, it means that you can do a lot of different experiments with those parameters in a single setting. So I really like that.
Yeah, and I think one catch up, one comment to the, I think, very previous one, where we like said, Angela said like that the fiber find is only now previous for the circular fibers. So we're still working on the fiber find AI to be usable for more diameter or like cross-sectional shapes in this kind of sense. So the first step was, of course, where for circular one and for a very broad range. But I think since last year, we offer also like a new GeoDict AI module. And this gives you the capabilities to train your own neural networks, which use the fiber geo as input data. So we can generate here different fiber types, of course, ellipsoid, curved, hollow, whatever you would be interested in. And then you can get shipped from the module, you get your own neural networks, you get the statistics of the neural network. So how good does it fit with the test data, training data, And then you can generate your own neural network, which you can use then specifically only for your input data, which might be not circular in this kind of sense, but maybe ellipsoid or whatever.
Exactly. And I saw in the documentation where you broke down each of these fiber shapes and said, okay, how do you do all of this and how do you create these and model them? And in that geodict, I hope you also saw in the geodict for the fiber find step, you had the option to use your own network in that case. And that's exactly how you would apply that for maybe your hollow fibers.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So that's all the time that we do have for questions. We don't have any additional questions, so we can move on to as I said earlier, recording the webinar will be available tomorrow, and an email will go out to all the registrants with instructions on how to view that recorded presentation. Links to the resources that we mentioned today in the chat will also be shared on that landing page. Now we'll be hosting our final workshop of the year and the final workshop of the filtration analysis series, focusing on simulations on Wednesday, December the 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Thank you and look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk again in September. Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.